Welcome to Tribal Talks, a show where we pull back the curtain on why enterprise systems feel slow, complex, and hard to change, and discuss how Tribal is rewriting that story. I'm your host, Rebecca McKenzie, and together with our guests, we break down the metadata, the technology, and the people behind the agentic enterprise. And today, AI-assisted development is moving fast inside the Salesforce ecosystem. But for enterprise architects, CIOs, and platform owners, speed isn't the main concern. The real question is, how do you move faster without breaking everything that you've built? Today, we're unpacking what it actually takes to govern AI-powered Salesforce development without slowing innovation and without losing control. I'm joined by Uri Pintov, Tribal's VP of Product, who brings the systems and architecture perspective behind how AI can operate responsibly inside of complex enterprise orgs. And Andy Fawcett. Andy is a Salesforce architect and ecosystem veteran with deep roots in both platform strategy and hands-on development. A former VP of product management and Heroku CPO at Salesforce, he's worked extensively with ISVs and product teams across the ecosystem. He's an open source contributor, author of a book on enterprise architecture for the Salesforce Platform, and he's the voice behind one of my favorite blogs, Andy in the Cloud. Now independent, he helps companies and ISVs design scalable Salesforce architectures, adopt emerging AI patterns like Agentforce, and build stronger, more resilient products on the platform. So we are very lucky to have him here today. Andy, Uri, welcome to Tribal Talks.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, Andy. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Sarah and Rebecca. Thanks for having me. Excited to get on with the conversation.
It's great to have you guys here. So I want to start with the tension that every enterprise team is feeling right now, which is speed versus control. So Andy, when you first started using AI inside of a Salesforce org, it made you pause and what felt risky?
Yeah, wow, that's going back. It's hard to believe it's nearly been 2 years since all of this took form for us all. And my first reactions were one of the speed of it, the fear that I'm losing control because it's just scrolling past me. I'll do this, I'll do that. But wait, we haven't had a conversation. And I realized that, it's also about engaging with it as you would any communication with anybody that you're working with, or it's an AI or a person, needs some dialogue and some context. So that was scary at first because it kind of assumed a lot. And then I was kind of, well, as it's scrolling by, is it well informed enough? Like, how's it made these decisions? It hasn't asked me questions. Mm-hmm. I've tried to put as much as I gradually learned that, bad prompt in, bad output, right? So I gradually learned good prompt in, but still, I'm like, I've typed enough, but did I type enough to give it enough information? And then is it skipping important decisions? Is it stopping to ask me for clarification? Or as we all know, is it making a lot of assumptions, just trying to please us? So, that was kind of my first experiences. And over time, I've learned to take the same principles I'll be doing for years now, which is work step by step through a proper process of understanding what you want to achieve, what your goals are, express those requirements, then work your way into architecture and into implementation. It really, the game hasn't changed there. These AI tools are helping us with that, but that pace and that process is still very important, if not even more, because of that. Just the speed at which AI can work if you really let the handbrake off and off it goes, So I think that was my tension. And sometimes I still get that, and I think it's tempting sometimes to be a bit lazy with AIs and just think, oh, it'll figure it out. But you'll find yourself, you've probably wasted more time than you've gained if you do that. So that was my tension and learning path for using AIs early doors. But I'm much less stressed these days using.
Yeah, I think you know what you're doing a lot more now. And it's when you talk about kind of taking that handbrake off and letting it go, it gives me this idea of kind of this fear of losing control. So do you hear architects talking about the fear of losing control a lot? What do you think they're really worried about?
I mean, I think ultimately whether, I've been around for a while here and I've seen tools come and go that aim to automate a lot of what we do. And I think ultimately an architect's job is that they're trusted by the business to deliver durable and robust architectures. And you can't do that if you're just bolting things on each time a new requirement goes, or not even thinking about the future. So again, it comes back to that planning about what creates a durable code base or a durable application. And sometimes you can afford to be incremental early days, but at some point, in order to really sustain, you've got to think about the future. So I think they worry about AIs making short-term decisions for quick gains, because that's what AIs like to do. Give you what you want, give you what you want. But it's up to us to really refine that as to, well, actually, this is what I want, but under this context, I've got this existing investment in the organization, and that organization needs that existing investment to continue to yield value. So I think as an architect, you're definitely tasked with being not just in the here and now, but in the past and in the future at the same time. So I think that's it's a big worry when architects use these tools, is how can they maintain that sort of that presence in each of those places.
Yeah, and I think you hit on there as well that Salesforce isn't just a code base, it's years of layered decisions, it's metadata, permissions, flows. So then what makes AI assisted development inside Salesforce more complex than you would see in a traditional software stack?
Yeah, oh boy. Well, again, I think there's a lot of parallels here before and after the advent and during the advent of AI, because the biggest power of Salesforce has always been, one of the things that's attracted me in the past and still, is that there's this balance between using code and no code, and how you can point and click your way is quite liberating. And you see a lot of the community and ecosystem is built up from people that had strong domain skills but didn't ever build apps before, and Salesforce suddenly liberated them to be able to do this with tools like Flow and custom objects and layouts and all those sort of things. And of course, Apex came along, and a lot of the skills are needed for that. But it's that kind of overlap and that kind of spectrum of options that I think makes Salesforce quite unique, because a lot of the LLMs have been trained on largely code syntax, Java, Python, Ruby, whatever, where it's all coded practically. And sure, this framework's similar to Salesforce in abstraction terms, but ultimately it's a very high level abstraction is Salesforce. So I think it's important for tools that AI platforms over a Salesforce and those using those tools to be cognizant that behavior is expressed in other forms, not just code. And that's XML in most cases with Salesforce. So, knowing what's in the XML, what's in your permission sets, what's in your layouts, what's in your flows, and really working your way through what that behavior means and what those relationships are, I think is the added challenge that we face when working with Salesforce. And I'm aware that those listening might find that we're tipping into a hotly debated topic of how much no code and code to use, but we're not going to go there, folks. Sorry to disappoint. But everybody knows the reality is that there's always some of both, and I think that's important in terms of understanding a Salesforce app.
Yeah.
One of the outcomes, I think, of what Andy is portraying is, I think many people now feel very empowered with AI tools to create and run fast and do amazing things. And then they bring it to the Salesforce ecosystem and, hey, I want to see this in production tomorrow. But if there's so many layers and peeling you have to do under the hood to understand the difference between a beautiful prototype demo and then a real running application inside Salesforce that really works for the business. And I think it's kind of our job, the admins, the implementers, the architects, to be in the loop and make sure that that happens in the correct way.
Can you dive a little bit deeper into that? What does AI really truly need to understand about an org before it can safely generate changes?
Sure. I think Andy touched a lot of that. And in one word, it's the context. It has to have the right context. And in two words, it's really the impact of the change you want to make. So in order to understand the impact of the change you're going to make, you have to have the context. And in the Salesforce world, the context has a lot to do with automations that exist, validation rules, existing UI, systems that integrate into Salesforce and that Salesforce sends outbound messages to. And so without that right context, it's very hard anybody can come and create the change. But if you don't know the impact of what you're doing, then it doesn't really run and scales in production. And then it has to do with, okay, how do you make the change? So I know what I'm going to do and I know the impact. But then how am I going to implement that? Do I use existing capabilities, existing objects where the data is? So I can create a new custom object, but the data is not there. So it's not going to work. Reuse things like record types, reports, Permissions is a huge subject. I think Salesforce Platform is so people don't realize how powerful it is in terms of the permissions and the sharing rules. And then in terms of maintainability, Andy, I think you touched that. Are you building for, flows that admins can maintain themselves, or is your team more developers and you want to build a beautiful LWC component? All of this is context and really what you're trying to achieve with what already exists. Keep in mind, some of the Salesforce customers have been running years with the Salesforce orgs that are full of historical implementations by their team implemented or a solution integrator implemented, and it's very hard to document and keep track of everything that happens.
So, like, what I'm hearing is that one of the biggest risks in enterprise is making these changes with AI before you fully understand it, before you have all this context. So, Andy, when you were exploring your org through AI, what surprised you about the dependencies or the relationships that you uncovered? What did you not expect to see?
Yeah, I think the one example I can give there is, and Yuri just hinted at, mentioned it around permissions, is it's very complex to set up and is in kind of steeped in a lot of layers of different evolutions of Salesforce's permissioning model. You've got profiles, obviously. People used to create tons of those before permission sets came along, and now you've got permission set groups. And then, of course, within each of those, you've got broader permissions that apply to every object or specific objects. So you've kind of got implicit and explicit permission. In the industry sense, one might refer to these as access control lists or rules, but there's some analogies there. But I think the one thing that when I'm exploring relationships that jumped out was that a permission set has the capability to be explicit about a particular object or field that you have access to. But you can also embed things in profiles and permission sets that give you wide encompassing org level rules around accessing all data and being able to update that. And that in itself is a dependency. It's not explicitly tied to any particular object. But actually, when you're creating a permission set or you're putting some code into an org, having the AI tool aware of these other relationships that it might not have seen actually connected through metadata explicitly is really important, because you want to know what's there, even if it's a pre-existing configuration, how it might impact your app. And that was quite surprising to me, to be able to see AI suddenly start to infer relationships that are kind of more runtime orientated rather than design time, and that's really important and helps keep the org healthy. I think, because sometimes if you don't see these things, you go ahead and create new ones.
Exactly. But when you learn about Salesforce permissions and profiles, you learn that it's kind of additive. So you get a profile, then you get another permission set, another permission. Every one of those opens up a little bit more, and it becomes over the years not an easy calculation to sum up all of those permission sets together to realize what a specific user or user group or queue have access to. And without that context, it's really, really hard to understand the hidden dependencies. So permissions is a wonderful example, and those the dependencies exist in other metadata types in Salesforce, from flows that point specifically to a field or an object, to a code that touches a whole bunch of objects and fields, but to the more implicit things like reporting and permissions that Andy touched, it's harder to calculate. And I think AI is better than us at calculating that quickly and summarizing it for us.
Why do you think it's better?
Just because of the scale and the amount of work that goes into analyzing before you understand what exists and you're ready to make a change. So in terms of speed and scale, I think at first when we started playing with these AI tools, they weren't accurate enough for us to trust them. And I think now it's becoming more of, okay, if I use them correctly, then I can trust that the result is accurate and I don't need to do it manually so much anymore. And that's a huge time saver when you can really focus on the business outcome and not so much maintaining the existing.
So there's so much existing already. With the enterprise teams are rarely actually starting from scratch. They're extending these systems that carry years of investment and decisions and changes. So why is incremental in context enhancement safer than rebuilding from scratch? Like, what does responsible reuse look like in practice? Andy, I'd love to get your point of view on that.
Safety comes from a desire to be confident about that you're not leaving any past investment on the table. Orgs been around for many years, and you've spent lots of person and dollar time working on those investments. So when you're starting to add new things, as we mentioned about the architect's kind of fears earlier, it's important to be able to look into the past. And to be responsible for reuse, you also need to think about how you actually create new investment as well in your org by layering that. One of the things that I at high level tend to want to have AIs think about is the difference between UI logic and business logic. Over time, I think everybody has been in the industry even a few years will see UI technology shifts an awful lot faster than the logic you've invested that contains your business logic, exactly what that's written in Apex, Node, Java, whatever. That is kind of the thing that's the most hard to rewrite and change and debug. So I really want the ability for AIs to be able to see layers and implement that logic in particular layers so that you can be more robust about making changes. And not only that, I want to make sure that if I'm investing in business logic, even if my UI, my experience is maybe for today a Lightning web component, tomorrow it might be an agent consuming it, it might be an API, it might be a flow. I want to make sure that that business logic doesn't have to change when those new use cases come around. So I think you know, what it means to be safe is to make sure that you look at those past investments. Hopefully, if you followed those layering principles, then looking back at that would result in something that I observed when using the tool with the Coral Cloud Salesforce sample application. It actually found a flow that pre-existed for booking experiences for the guests at the resort. And that flow was only wired up to an agent in the demo, but actually it hadn't been wired up to a button. If somebody just
Hmm.
wanted to click a good old fashioned button to actually book an experience, gosh, shock horror that you might still want to do that in these days. But the AI needs to be able to know not to go and reinvent just because it can see how to book an experience, insert this record here, fill these fields in, not to go and reinvent that. And I expect because somebody had chosen to implement the business logic in Flow, perfectly fine, that to be reused. And, that's what I expect from a safe experience and the investment in layering your investment so that the more you do that, the more it pays dividends down the road and you're generating less code. We don't want duplicate business logic anywhere, just any more than we wanted it before the AI era. We want it less so here because even though in some cases you might not always care to look at it will start to exist if you're not careful. And that's going to cost one way or another. So let's just create well structured, meaningful, laid out experiences. And that applies whether you're building new systems or extending existing ones.
Yeah. So then, Ori, from a product perspective, how do you ensure that you're preventing AI from duplicating logic or inventing unnecessary components
That's the hard
instead
part.
of like Andy said, reusing what exists? Like, how do you actually prevent that?
That's the really hard part. And I think we're definitely on a journey towards that. And I think it starts with what we talked about initially, the context and the metadata fabric. AI needs access to what exists on an ongoing basis. So not just once, but on an ongoing basis, when somebody makes changes, AI needs to be aware that what's changed. And then what is being used? That's a huge question. Who is using that field or who has access? AI must be aware because maybe there's 7 different objects with the same word risk in them, but it's not documented anywhere. And only one of them is being used. And that's where all your data is. And when you create something new, you should use that one so AI should be smart enough to suggest that. It's definitely getting to the point where it's smart enough to suggest using the right existing metadata. But it's more than that. It's also depends on what Salesforce licenses you have and
Mm,
which features you turned on in your org. And keep in mind, that over the years, Salesforce has shipped so much innovation, right? 3 releases a year, but some companies and orgs started before that. So you might be using something custom, but now you want to migrate to using something standard, which in some cases makes a lot of sense, but that's not an easy thing to do. And AI has the context to guide you through that. and to suggest the options and to also explain the impact. If you choose to go in that path, what are you leaving behind? And what's the gain? Are there any licensing implications? What are your users using today? These are huge things that any new leader, whether it's from RevOps to IT to HR, if they get these answers fast, they can move fast and make a change. That usually takes the longest time.
Mm-hmm. So you're talking a lot about AI needing context, but it sounds like it also needs some constraints as well. So if AI is going to build in your org, Andy, can you talk me through what are the architectural non-negotiables that you need to have AI respect when it's going to build in your org?
Well, I think the obvious one probably to go straight out the gate is security and trust. It has to be number one. And if we look, for example, towards Apex code that's been generated by AI, CRUD and FLS and sharing enforcement, as Yuri pointed out, these are very, very powerful features, and businesses spend a long time crafting who has access to what, hopefully. But in doing so, that needs to be honored, and it's not the default for Apex to do that. It hasn't been, and I'm not sure whether that'll ever become the case. So there is some code that needs to be used, some coding techniques, and making sure you're using the user mode context for both your updates and your queries. Sharing is keywords are used in Apex. And in the past, it's something that's really, I think some listeners might be wondering, well, I've never really needed to use those because you've maybe been developing Apex code in-house and the users in your organization are trusted. And, that's fine. And they trust that code that's been written. It'll only do certain things. And largely that's true. Therefore, what I've just described has only really been historically the focus of App Exchange packages. You install something, you need it to honor the security rules in your organization for the code it runs. But I would argue that these days, certainly over the last year or so, that you can't always guarantee your employees are the ones accessing your org's data. So if, heaven forbid, any of that Apex code gets called in a compromised way, then best make sure that it's honoring the security rules that you set up. It'll at least defend you in some way. So I really want to urge, whether we're writing code in packages or it's simply in a customer's org directly, that it honors security, and therefore AIs must do the same. And the good thing is there's a lot written up about this for AIs to digest. There's scanners, there's a Salesforce security scanner that AIs can run and react to that. And we see that all the time in different IDEs and such like. And then secondly, I think we talked about knowledge of what's come before. That was kind of be my number two non-negotiable. I think it's wasteful. I think I will say that pragmatism sometimes has an opportunity to say, we had time to market or certain other pressure, and reuse isn't always a given. So especially if you have to rework things to make them reusable. But I think you just need to keep an eye on how many times you use that kind of get out of jail card. So I will say that you can't get away without thinking about knowledge of what's come before and preparation for what was going to come in the future. So that comes back to all that layering we just talked about, making sure you layer things properly so it can be reused. And it talks about being able to see what's available to be reused. And then robustness. Things erode over time. It's just the natural course of things, both in physical life as it is in digital. And we need to protect against that. So just because we had a machine generate some application code or configuration doesn't mean to say we don't need to keep an eye on test automation and as much automation as possible. And I think there's a really good opportunity for AI to really help us with an area that just took an awful lot of time in the past, so like data generation, synthetic data generation. And normally you'd probably write some scripts, but they wouldn't be that synthetic because the scripts themselves would create more ordered data, and you'd only see problems you wouldn't see less corner case problems because the data was a little bit too pure. Whereas AIs have the ability to create kind of what I like to call evil and good data. And I think, the opportunity for AIs to help us with robustness and in the tests that they write, as well as the data they create. And I will give one final caveat there. I'm not suggesting we go and trust those tests. Again, trust and verify. Let's make sure it's understanding. But if you've gone through the effort of understanding some of the reasons and motivations for what you're building, then a lot of the tests that are proposed to you by AIs will be more aligned with that. So you'll find yourself questioning them less if you've bothered to state what your goals are, your KPIs and things, and what your users want. So I find AIs increasingly good at creating good test plans and tests, providing, of course, good input.
I love this point, and definitely I would attest to the fact that I've seen AI create much better tests than I come up with, and think of edge cases that would have thought of much later in the UAT phase. Super important and the time saver. Maybe touch on one other point. I 100% agree with Andy. When you generate something, whether it's Apex or Flow or a field, there's an art of how much you let the AI generate itself and how much you guide it. Prompting is of course basics, but there's a lot of things you can do with a human in the loop to make sure that you're building the right thing, or with templates or just hard code rules. All of these play in the game. And I think at least in the near future, I don't know about the long run, in the near future, you need all of those together to generate something that is secure and will pass all of those tests. But I think another point that Andy makes here and is super important is building is just one part. And if you're in the Salesforce ecosystem, you know that it's a whole chain of activities that happen, from defining the requirements, architecting, building, testing, deploying. In each one of those phases, you can use AI, but it has to be with a human in the loop. It has to be reviewed that you're heading in the right direction, because otherwise you're going to build things that are not going to work in production, and the tests won't pass and the deployment will fail. And so I kind of see, all the roles of the Salesforce team, the admin, the implementer, the analyst, like play a part in making sure that when AI has the freedom to create, to write a requirement, to architect, to generate, to test, it has to come with a human in the loop that is supervising and making sure everything's on the right track and moving it in the right direction. And I kind of definitely see us heading in that direction.
Yeah, when I think about the rules you brought up there, a lot of AI tools know those as kind of there's different ways of injecting those with MD files and instructions and things like that you can put in your projects. But rules as a generic term are basically static instructions that are always passed into the AI without you having to repeat yourself all of the time. And I think about my little list there of non-negotiable things: security, knowledge of what's come before, and robustness. Each of those has, beyond just the ones I've listed, your own organizational requirements, whether it's like, yes, we're going to honor CRUD and FLS, but we also have these other security requirements or coding guidelines. Or when it comes down to test automation, my personal favorite layout is a layout known as given, when, then. I love to see my test names named like that and my tests broken down to given when we do this, then when we do that, we expect this. And I think that's a really easy way of reading code that does tests and even reading tests. So I think the rules help bake in some of those extra layers on top of the must-haves that make it unique to you, and also make it look like code you've also written in the past as much as it's AI-written code.
I've seen many developers start with test-driven development, like writing the tests first, but letting the AI write the tests first.
Yeah.
And that's crazy, and it works.
So I want to jump into, you're starting to say this AI works. And what I'm hearing is that you guys now have kind of confidence in AI generated changes as long as you have that visibility. So Andy, tell me a little bit about that turning point in, the last few years. At what point did you feel confident reviewing AI generated changes? What gave you that trust?
I think it's been the theme throughout some of these other answers, really. It's about having that sort of multi-step checkpoint through the process of ideation, requirements refinement, architectural design, and then steps to implement the code. And I think having that pacing helps you feel more like you're in control, and helps me feel more confident that it's doing what it needs to do. I mean, the worst kind of thing is, funny story here, is like if I ask an AI to do something and suddenly it's time to go eat, I feel compelled to stay at my screen until the scrolling stops because I don't want it to go and do things while I'm off eating somewhere. And I think that when you're feeling that way, it's probably because you've given the AI too much scope, and it might go, well, you'll come back after you've had your lovely meal, and all of a sudden it's rewritten the entire app. If you go through if you go through all of the different stages properly with setting the expectations and finally, you build a very incremental model. Like some of the things I'll say, hey, I want to convert some opportunities to a quote. And for now, the logic for the calculations is very simple. Just map the values. It's worthy just saying that than saying, actually, sometimes I want it to be discounted by region. That can really blow the AI a lot. And it'll ask lots of questions. It'll get confused amongst itself. So I think it's up to us to think about it in terms of how we want to stage and unveil the ideas to it. And you can do that in different ways. You can set out the big plan at the very top. But I think to some degree, I like to have the big plan in my head and kind of unveil it a little bit along as I go along. But yeah, I think for me, it was really just feeling confident by adhering to that kind of that way of working, which turns out, the another analogy here is I use is like if I was working with a junior individual, they would want this practice, this upfront knowledge, this communication, this step-by-step process. And I would want that as well because, often AIs are somewhat like junior individuals in the industry where they might run off and do everything really quickly, come back, and it might not be exactly what you want. And that doesn't help anybody. And so I think there's a lot of parallels I find with the way we deal with AIs and the way we have to deal with ourselves when we're collaborating. So yeah, that's how I feel more confident. Does it sometimes do things that I don't expect it to do? Yeah, I learn. It learns. And sometimes I just go, okay, I'll change it myself. And I think that's the important thing to be able to do as well. Sometimes it's just quicker if you know the change you want to make, just to get in there and change it and then say, I've gone and changed it. It'll go, oh, thank you very much. And it'll move on.
So I'll definitely say that for experienced architects like Andy, definitely sometimes they know what they want to achieve. So it's just faster to do it themselves. But many admins, I think, feel very empowered by AI to do things that they wouldn't have been able to do by themselves and have to wait for a developer. So I think our job is kind of to help them make the changes in a responsible manner. I think part of that is Salesforce is super strong. And also, other large enterprise applications are super strong at the road to production. Yes, you can run and go crazy with AI and deploy to a developer org, a developer sandbox, and then somebody reviews. And the beautiful thing is that you can run tests and see where it fails. And you make many mistakes, but no worries. I can run 10 agents at the same time and until I get it right. When you get it right, you promote to something like a full sandbox and do proper UAT and testing. Then even if you did 10 cycles or one, at the end of the day, what you're going to promote to production using all the tools that are being used responsibly to promote to production. I don't see us AI generating directly into production tomorrow. That could happen later. I see AI more viewing, scanning, and reporting problems in production rather than creating new things on the fly. But I think there's a very good way to deploy into production, even if you are letting AI have a little bit more freedom, if you test it well, and if you know how to test it well, and if you know the critical failure points in the context of the impact of the change that you're making.
Now, I'll say very quickly, one thing that's also worth noting is that AI can be used for a lot of innovation and ideation and exploration. The end output, the one way of being less stressed about the output, if you set your expectations that I'm in experiment mode, I don't have to push this to a sandbox or I can go to a scratch org, then just see what it creates, chat with it, because just like good innovation and ideation, you have to sometimes let down some of all the governance and controls we've been talking about to allow that creativity to happen. And the same is true when you're working with AIs as much as it is people. So I think, it's about knowing when you need these controls and when you don't. So I think that there's definitely a good place for AI to help us with exploration, ideation, and just prototypes.
Yeah, I love that point, Andy, of that kind of mindset shift of being open to exploring with AI. And then when you need to, giving it the context, the constraints to move in the direction that you specifically want it to move in. So I'd love to explore that a little bit more. What do you think the big mindset shifts are that leaders need to make before they start bringing AI assisted development into their Salesforce organization?
I think, I suddenly realized now I kind of jumped ahead on some of my thoughts here. Is about kind of making sure that you're in the right place with your organization. Has your organization got the right documentation about what you've implemented? Where are kind of some of the bodies buried? And if you haven't got that, going back and doing that, this isn't an excuse not to have that. Even though what we've talked about does a lot of analysis, it will just look at your org as it is. And sometimes the history isn't always in what's in your org and what the AIs and the machines can see. It's in your emails, it's in your discussions. So I think, being ready for it is as much about having your ship in order as it ever was before, because the consequences of not of that are much greater because you're using AI and there's temptation to run fast and keep moving. That can, obviously you can revert very quickly and try different things, but it's costly to do that ultimately. So I think it's best to make sure that you have governance guidelines, healthy org status, coding guidelines and things like that are in play than ever more, to be honest, because of the implications of AI.
The way I think about it is also we're living in a place where I think every department, like the CEO, CIO, given access to every department to use AI tools and run fast. And you see amazing things and tools and agents being built from sales to marketing to HR to finance. Everybody's doing amazing things. And I think there's kind of this pressure on the IT team to also innovate and make a big impact for the business. And I think these tools have a potential of making them super champions where they are able to respond very quickly, much more quickly than before, to business needs and changing business needs, and make the business feel like they're iterating fast and they're part of the creation process. So it's not like, here's a report I need and I'll see you in 4 months and we'll test it together. It's like, here's a huge change we're going to do to the organization, and let's let the business be part of that change and iterate fast and show mock-ups and get feedback and put it in, sandbox and production super fast, like weeks instead of months. And suddenly you have partners that you're innovating and making huge impact. And I think that's where the new leaders will emerge, and that's where we'll see the successful companies.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point on that mindset shift of how fast you can truly move now when you adopt AI. And Andy, I would love to close with some final thoughts from you. If AI app development is done correctly, using all the context, the constraints, the security that we talked about, and then sometimes just letting it go, what changes for enterprise teams day to day? What does the new world look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably, without repeating my previous order, it's just re-emphasizing the fact of having your house in order, and you can use AI to help you get the house in order. Is kind of the fun thing as well. If you don't know where the bodies are buried, you don't know where things are, then use some AI to go and help you discover it. But document that, whatever you do, capture that, because that feeds as input into your next projects. So if you need coding guidelines or strategy guidelines, then you can work with AIs to help you create those. But again, do that cognitively and validate and verify that's really what you want, because they're happy to spit out quite a lot of content and it's sometimes intimidating to read. I think, just to reiterate, make sure that you kind of respect the same level investment to make sure your house is in order that you would normally do. And if you don't have that, then use some AI to help get you back to that spot and then press on.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Ori, any final thoughts from you?
No, just thank you, Andy, for spending time with us, and really love learning from you every time we meet. Yeah, 100% agree. I think AI is going to build confidence to these teams to move faster and more responsibly. So 100% agree.
Yeah, what really stood out to me in this conversation is that governance and speed aren't opposite things, and the real risk isn't that AI is moving too fast. It's what we talked about, that AI moving without context. So, Andy, Ori, thank you both for bringing the practitioner and the product perspective to this
You're welcome.
conversation.
Thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
If you want to hear more from Andy, follow him on LinkedIn. And I would highly, highly recommend checking out his blog, Andy in the Cloud, where he shares a wealth of knowledge on Salesforce. And if you want to dive deeper into Tribal's approach, you can learn more at gotribal.ai. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Tribal Talks.